The small thing in the snow. The storm had been going for 3 days when Myra found it. It was the kind of storm the Ashen Palace seemed to generate from its own cold pride, not the honest, howling blizzards of the northern villages she had grown up near, but a slow, suffocating snowfall that piled itself against walls and swallowed hedgerows and turned the outer courtyards into a white silence so complete it felt like the world had decided to stop commenting on itself. The palace grounds were vast, and the east wing courtyards were the furthest from the main halls and the warmest hearths, which was precisely why they were assigned to Myra and no one else. She was the lowest-ranked maid in the entire Ashen Palace, a human, which made her lower still in a court full of dragon-blooded nobility who barely acknowledged her existence as a category, let alone as a person. Her job was to clear the outer courtyards of snow before the noble households woke, before anyone important had to look at the mess the world made of itself overnight. It was cold work, invisible work, the kind of labor that only mattered when it went undone. Nobody thanked her when the stones were clear. They would have noticed sharply and loudly if they weren't. She had been at it since before dawn, working by lantern light and then by the thin gray morning that seeped over the mountains like an afterthought. Her breath came in clouds. Her fingers had gone past cold into that particular distant numbness that felt almost like warmth if you didn't think too carefully about it. She had cleared the main yard and the path to the eastern gate, and was working on the long stretch beside the formal hedge garden, tall sculpted hedgerows of black-needled frost pine, the kind of ornamental plantings that existed to impress visiting dignitaries and required enormous maintenance and served no practical purpose whatsoever, when she almost stepped on the child. She saw the edge of silver first, just a crescent of pale iridescent scale visible at the base of the hedge, where the snow had drifted up against the dense lower branches and created a hollow, and something small and rigid had fallen or been placed or simply collapsed into that hollow and been half consumed by the storm. She stopped. She set down her shovel with the careful, unhurried motion her grandmother had taught her. No sudden movements near unknown things in winter, the old woman had said, because panic wastes heat and heat is life. She crouched, she brushed snow away from the crescent of silver. The crescent became a wrist. The wrist became an arm. The arm belonged to a small body curled on its side, rigid and unmoving, knees drawn up, one fist pressed against a cheek that had gone pale as birch bark. Not dead, she knew the look of dead things, which was a particular kind of stillness, a total relinquishment. This was a different kind of stillness. She pressed 2 fingers to the underside of the wrist, to the place where her grandmother had shown her the pulse ran close to the surface in children and animals, and held her own breath and waited. There, slow and deep as a glacier, the heartbeat of something alive. She sat back on her heels and took a breath, and looked at what she had found with the clear-eyed attention of someone taking inventory before deciding on a course of action. It was a dragon child. This was not a conclusion she had to work toward. It announced itself plainly in the silver scales that covered the backs of the hands and climbed the forearms, in the faint luminescence still present in the skin even now, even frozen, a cold inner light like phosphorescence in deep water. In the tiny twin ridges along the visible line of the spine, just barely distinguishable beneath the fine cloth of a sleeping garment that was both far too expensive and far too thin for outdoor winter weather. Dragon children were rare in the palace. There were perhaps a dozen in the whole sprawling complex, the offspring of noble families, and most of them were kept well away from the servant quarters and the outer courtyards. But Myra had been in this palace for 3 years, and she listened to the conversations around her the way people with no official power always learn to listen, carefully, completely filing things away. She had been listening for weeks to the whispers that moved through the servant halls like a cold draft through bad window seals. The Dragon King's youngest, the one called Solon. A condition, a paralytic curse, the court healers said, though there was debate about whether it was curse or illness or something more complicated than either word could hold. It came without warning. It seized the child's body mid-motion and left him locked wherever he fell, helpless and immovable, until the curse passed on its own terms in its own time. He had been found frozen mid-step on a staircase. Found locked into the position of reaching for a cup at the breakfast table. Found in a garden once, standing rigid with one hand raised as though pointing at something in the sky. A perfect silver statue, eyes open and aware and unable to move so much as a finger. The Dragon King had been quietly, terrifyingly furious about it. Not at Solon, the servants were clear on this, emphatic about it, as though it mattered that the anger was aimed correctly, but at the universe itself, at every healer and mage who came with their instruments and their theories and their carefully worded explanations for why they could not fix it, at the fundamental helplessness the condition represented. He was a being of absolute power. The Ashen Court answered to him. Lesser kingdoms accommodated him. The world had arranged itself over the centuries around the fact of his authority, and his child was fragile and scared and could be struck immobile by his own body at any moment, and there was not a thing in all that power that was shaped for this particular problem. The whispers said Solon had stopped going outside much, stopped playing in the garden, started moving through the palace in that careful, watchful way that children learn when they have been taught to distrust something, in this case, his own body, his own capacity to simply exist in motion through the world. Myra looked at the frozen child for a long moment, the frost on his eyelashes, the rigid set of his small shoulders, the fist still pressed to the pale cheek, the fingers slightly curled as though he had been reaching for something when the curse hit. She was a human maid, third tier, East Wing housekeeping, the part of the roster that existed below the level of anyone importance notice. If she touched the Dragon King's child without explicit permission, she could be dismissed without reference, without recourse, without a second conversation. If something went wrong while the child was in her care, if the curse progressed, if there was a complication, if any of 100 possible things happened that she had no control over, she could be executed. Not threatened with execution as a formality, actually executed in the way that courts with dragons in them sometimes executed people, which was memorable and permanent and left nothing for anyone to bury. There was a smart, safe, sensible course of action available to her. It involved putting down her shovel and walking briskly to the East Wing guard post and informing whoever was there that she had found something in the hedge garden and required someone with appropriate authority to come and handle it. Clean, simple, not her problem after that. She looked at the small, frozen face. The pale cheek, the frost on the eyelashes, the child's fist pressed against the cold skin with the helpless self-comfort of someone whose body had locked on them, maybe in the night, maybe in the dark, in the snow and the storm, and had been lying here in the hedge hollow for who knew how long while the palace slept. Myra took off her outer coat. She wrapped it around Solon's rigid body, tucking the edges in, trying to create a seal against the cold with the warmth that still lived in the wool from her own body. Then she picked him up. He was heavier than he looked. Dragon children were dense with something that went beyond ordinary mass, bone density perhaps, or whatever the biological fact of scale and heat-resistant tissue translated into on a scale, but carrying him was like carrying a child and a half, and she had a good 50 yards to cover to get to the nearest warm interior. She managed it by not thinking about it, which was the same method she used for most of the harder parts of her job. Her own quarters were a single room at the end of the East Wing servant corridor, small, low-ceilinged, with one window that faced north and offered a view of the mountain wall and very little else. It was the least desirable room in the servant quarters, which was why it was hers. It had, however, two things that mattered right now: a narrow bed and a small iron stove that she kept burning through winter nights because the East Wing was cold even by palace standards, and she had discovered in her first year that hypothermia was a real professional hazard she had to manage personally. She laid Solon on the bed with the careful deliberateness of someone setting down something breakable. She tucked the blankets around the rigid little body, not trying to move the limbs, not trying to reposition him, just building warmth around whatever shape he was already in. She lit every candle she owned, which was 7, and arranged them in a rough ring around the bed at a distance that would add ambient heat without risk. She put her largest pot of water on the stove, and while it heated she sat on the edge of the bed and kept her hands pressed flat against the blankets over the child's feet, using herself as an additional heat source, which was something her grandmother had taught her about warming frozen things. Her grandmother had lived in the high northern villages, where the winters came in earnest and people froze and animals froze, and every household knew the difference between cold that could be reversed and cold that couldn't. She had grown up with those distinctions as practical knowledge, not theory. You warmed things slowly. You built the heat from the outside in gentle and gradual, because a frozen body shocked back to warmth too fast could seize in other ways, could sustain damage from the sudden change. You used layers, you used your own body heat when you had nothing better. You talked to them, her grandmother had said, with the certainty of someone who had confirmed this through direct experience. You let them hear a voice, give them something warm to come back toward. Myra didn't know if dragon children could hear while the curse had them. She didn't know if this particular stillness worked the same as winter stillness, or if the rules she knew applied to this situation at all. But the rule about talking seemed like it couldn't hurt, and her grandmother had been right about most other things. And so when the water was warm enough and the cloths were soaking, and she had arranged them carefully against the blankets around Solon's hands and feet, she sat back down beside him and she talked. She told him about the storm, about the courtyard she had been clearing, about the particular way the frostpine hedge threw shadows in lantern light, about the crescent of silver she had noticed at the base of the branches and how she had almost nearly come very close to stepping right over it in the dark. She told him it was a good thing she had been paying attention, which she always was, because the East Wing courtyards rewarded attention and punished assumptions, and she had learned this in her first month when she had walked into a low ornamental wall she had been certain wasn't there. She told him about her grandmother's village, about the way the snow there looked nothing like palace snow, wilder and less considered, Snow that fell because it felt like it and didn't organize itself around anyone's aesthetic preferences. Snow that buried things honestly rather than decoratively. She told him about the way the village looked in the deep winter, the smoke from a dozen chimneys all rising in parallel columns in the still air of the coldest mornings, and how she had thought when she was small that the village was breathing, that it was a single breathing thing made of houses and fires and people. She told him about Boots. Boots had been a dog of no particular breed and very limited intelligence and absolute unlimited devotion. The kind of dog that existed to demonstrate that love did not require competence or coordination. He had gotten his head stuck in a water bucket once, properly fully stuck, the bucket wedged around his ears, and had walked in circles for 10 minutes before orientation had failed him entirely, and he had transitioned to walking in straight lines, which had resulted in him walking directly into the woodpile, then the corner of the barn, then the gate post, then the water trough. Each collision producing a resonant metallic donk that had eventually brought Myra's grandmother out of the house to see what was making that noise. Extracting the bucket had required 3 people, and a considerable amount of mutual dignity sacrifice from everyone involved, including Boots, who had emerged wagging his tail with the absolute confidence of an animal who believed wholeheartedly that everything that had just happened had gone exactly according to plan. Myra told this story with the full detail it deserved, including the donk sounds, which she reproduced quietly so as not to startle a frozen child. She told it and she felt her shoulders come down from wherever she had been holding them, which was apparently somewhere near her ears. She hadn't noticed. The tension had been there since the hedge, since the moment she had picked up Solon and committed to the course of action that could get her dismissed or executed, and it had been living in her shoulders like a second skeleton made of anxiety, and at some point in the Boots story it simply released, because she was here now and the child was here and the candles were burning and the blankets were warm and whatever was going to happen and there was nothing more useful to do than talk. Solon's fingers twitched, just once, just slightly, the smallest possible movement, barely more than a suggestion of movement, but there. Real, voluntary or involuntary she couldn't tell, but the fingers of his right hand, curled against the blanket, shifted by perhaps the width of a thought. She stopped talking and watched. Then she kept talking, because if that was working she wasn't going to change anything. It was another hour before he could move his head. A small movement first, a tension in the neck, and then a slow turn, incremental and labored, toward the candles, like a plant finding light. She watched it happen without touching him, without doing anything that might interfere with whatever the body was doing on its own terms. Another hour after that before he opened his eyes. They were gold, not amber, not yellow gold, the particular saturated warm metallic gold of something that had been made to be noticed, blinking up at the low plank ceiling of a human maid's room with an expression of profound and sincere disorientation. He looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he looked at the candles. Then he found Myra, sitting in the chair she had pulled to the bedside at some point without fully registering the decision to do so. And he looked at her with those gold eyes that were trying to do too many things at once: process location, process the face of a stranger, process the gap between wherever he had last been and wherever he was now. "You're in the East Wing," Myra said, keeping her voice low and even the same voice she'd been using for the last 2 hours. "Servants' quarters, you were in the hedge garden, in the frostpine hedge near the east gate. I found you when I was clearing snow and I brought you in." He stared at her. He had a child's face, 7 or 8 years old by human measure, though she knew dragon years moved differently and he might be older in certain ways and younger in others. His voice, when it finally came, was rough and slow, moving like something that had been stored somewhere cold and was remembering its function. "You're human," he said. "I am." A pause. He seemed to be taking stock of this, filing it. "Why did you help me?" It was such a direct question. No court manners in it, no framing, no careful approach, just the question itself, asked with the complete sincerity of someone who actually needed the answer. She could hear in it all the hours of being frozen in various places throughout the palace, all the times the curse had hit, and the response had been formal and efficient and correct. Healers and guards and attendants doing their jobs with appropriate gravity, and maybe somewhere underneath all of that the question of asterisk, why asterisk? The question of what made a person choose to act versus not act, which was a question no one had apparently put in simple language for him. Myra thought about the answer for a moment, not because she didn't know it, but because it deserved to be said simply the way he had asked it. "You were cold," she said, "and small and alone." Solon looked at her for a long time with those bright, gold, serious eyes. "Oh," he said. He said it quietly, and with a weight to it that didn't belong on a single syllable, as though it were an asterisk O asterisk that was doing a great deal of interior work, reorganizing something, shifting furniture around in some room of his understanding, making space for a piece of information about the world that he hadn't had before and was now trying to figure out where to put. The candles burned, the stove ticked with heat. The storm pressed against the window with the patient irrelevance of weather that has no opinion about what is happening inside. Myra got up and went to check the water on the stove, which was warm now and ready, and she poured some carefully into a cup and brought it back and helped him sit up enough to drink, which he did slowly and without complaint. Outside, the snow kept falling. The east wing courtyard she had not finished clearing would still be there in the morning. The frostpine hedges would still need their paths cut. The palace would wake and require its stones to be clear and its exterior to be presentable, and its lowest-ranked human maid to be invisible and functional, and not doing anything that drew attention. All of that was true, and Myra knew it and set it aside without anxiety. Because right now the only thing that mattered was the warmth in this small room and the child with gold eyes sitting up in her narrow bed, holding a cup in both hands that were no longer locked or frozen but moving again slowly, steadily, like something remembering how to be alive. That was enough, that was everything. That, Myra thought, was exactly what her grandmother would have done. What the Dragon King found. Verk, king of the Ashen Court, sovereign of the Sunken Peaks, breaker of the Jade Accord, found his son in a human servant's room eating porridge. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. Literally eating porridge, sitting up in a narrow bed surrounded by cheap tallow candles that had burned themselves down to their last quarter-inch, holding a small wooden bowl in both hands with the focused attention of someone who had decided that eating this particular bowl of porridge was the most important thing currently happening in the world. Beside him, perched on the edge of a hard wooden chair that she had pulled up close to the bedside, was a human woman, dark-haired, plainly dressed, clearly and completely terrified in a way she was working very hard not to show, in the middle of recounting something about a dog and a bucket, her hands moving with the animated precision of someone committed to doing justice to a good story. Solon was laughing. Not politely, not the careful social performance of a child who had learned which sounds to produce in which situations to satisfy adults. Actually laughing, shoulders shaking, gold eyes bright with it, porridge temporarily forgotten in the bowl while he processed the part about the dog walking into the gate post and the metallic resonance of the collision, which the woman was apparently reproducing with her knuckles against the wooden bed frame. Donk. Verk stood in the doorway, which was too small for him, the lintel at the level of his collarbone, the frame built for human proportions and offering his current form no particular courtesy, and he did not announce himself. He stood and he watched. He had not heard his son laugh in 4 months. He knew the exact count because he had been keeping it without meaning to, the way you keep track of things that used to be ordinary and have stopped being ordinary, the way the absence of a sound you expect to hear becomes a kind of noise in itself. 4 months since the curse had arrived and taken up residence in Solon's body and begun its work of turning the simple act of movement into a threat. 4 months since Solon had learned to be afraid of his own legs, his own hands, his own capacity to simply exist in forward motion through the world. 4 months of watching his son move through the palace with the careful, measuring watchfulness of an animal that has learned the ground can give way without warning, testing each step before trusting it, keeping his back to walls where possible, avoiding staircases and heights and any situation that might find him frozen somewhere difficult. Laughter had stopped along with everything else. Not immediately. At first, Solon had tried to maintain the appearance of ordinary childhood, had gone to his lessons and his meals and his scheduled time in the garden with the dutiful effort of a child trying not to worry the adults around him. But the effort of maintaining that performance while simultaneously managing the constant low-level dread of the curse had been too much, and gradually the performance had simplified itself. Solon had gotten quieter. More interior. The laughter had gone first, then the spontaneous questions, then the unsolicited observations about things he found interesting. All the small, unprompted expressions of a child's engagement with the world. Until what remained was a polite and careful and anxious small person who answered questions when addressed and volunteered very little, and moved through his days with the energy conservation of someone who had decided that enthusiasm was a resource he couldn't afford. Verk had watched this happen. He had watched it with the particular helplessness of someone whose entire identity was organized around the capacity to address problems directly, and who had encountered a problem that was not addressable directly, and who did not have a functional alternative strategy. He had brought in every qualified healer in the court. He had commissioned extensive research. He had made it explicitly and forcefully clear to his entire magical staff that resolving this was the current priority above all other priorities, which had resulted in a great deal of activity and impressive-sounding progress reports and precisely zero change in Solon's condition. He had not known what else to do, so he had kept doing more of what wasn't working, because the alternative was acknowledging that he did not know what to do, and he was not constructed for that acknowledgement. And now he was standing in a servant's doorway watching his son laugh at a story about a dog. The woman, Myra, he already knew her name, had known it for the last 20 minutes since the guard at the East Wing checkpoint had given him the account of a third-tier housekeeping maid who had been seen carrying something from the hedge garden through the servant entrance. And he had pulled her entry from the staff roster on his way here, her name and her tier and her assignment and her 3 years of service, all the documented surface of a person who had been in his palace, and below his notice for 3 years. Myra noticed him first. Her face went white. Not the slow fade of gradual realization, but the immediate, total whitening of someone who had turned and encountered something large and dangerous in an enclosed space, and whose body had responded faster than thought. She stood immediately, the porridge spoon still in her hand because there had not been time to put it down, and she pressed her back against the far wall with the automatic instinct of someone who had learned, somewhere and at some cost, that the correct behavior around sudden large predators was to make yourself small and still and offer no provocation and hope. "Your Majesty," she said. Her voice barely shook. He noted that. He noted it the way he noted things that were unexpected, filed it away in the part of his attention that tracked data points that didn't fit the expected pattern. Solon turned at the sound of her voice-changing register, saw his father filling the doorway and went still, not the cursed stillness, not the lock of the paralysis, just the ordinary absolute freeze of a child who has been caught somewhere unanticipated by a parent who has not yet revealed whether they are angry. His gold eyes moved between Verk and the doorframe and back. The bowl of porridge sat forgotten in his hands. "Father," he said. Verk let the silence sit for a moment. He was taking inventory of the room, because inventory was something he could do, a method of being present that didn't require him to sort through the complicated thing happening in his chest. The room was small, smaller than the antechambers of any room in the main palace, smaller than some of the closets. One north-facing window, one iron stove burning well-managed, the low ceiling, the plank floor. The narrow bed that Solon sat in, which was built for a single adult of human proportions and was somewhat inadequate for a dragon child's width, but had been made to work with additional blankets tucked firmly around the edges. The candles, 7 of them he counted, all burned low, arranged in a ring around the bed at a careful distance. Not decorative, functional, positioned for heat dispersion rather than light. On the small table, cloths folded neatly. A basin of water still faintly steaming, which meant it had been kept warm and refreshed throughout. The faint damp patches on the floor near the foot of the bed where snow melt had dripped and dried. The coat hung over the chair back, a woman's coat, plain wool, damp around the lower hem, which was the coat that had been wrapped around his son when the East Wing guard had seen Myra carrying Solon inside. He looked at his son's color, better than it had been in weeks. The pallor that the curse brought with it, that flat grayish undertone beneath the silver scales that the healers had documented with concern in their reports, was gone. Solon looked warm, he looked present, he looked like himself, which was something Verk had been working very hard not to notice had been slipping away. He looked at Myra's. She had not moved from the wall. She was still holding the spoon. Her face had reorganized itself from the initial terror into something more composed, more professional, the expression of someone who had decided that whatever was going to happen was going to happen, and the correct response was to be calm and clear and take it as it came. "You found him outside," Verk said. It wasn't a question. He had already spoken to the checkpoint guard, had already reconstructed the sequence of events as far as it could be reconstructed from external observation. He said it the way he said things he knew but wanted confirmed aloud, to give the other person the shape of what he understood and see what they added to it. "In the East Hedge Garden, Your Majesty, the Frostpine section near the East Gate, I was clearing snow during my morning shift." Her voice was steady now, the initial shock absorbed, the professional composure holding. He was at the base of the hedge in a drift hollow, half buried. "How long do you estimate he had been there?" A brief consideration. She was not guessing carelessly. He could see her actually thinking about it, working from evidence. The snow around him had refrozen over the top of him. There was a crust, minimum several hours, possibly since before the storm intensified, which would put it at late evening or night before. A pause. "He was very cold, Your Majesty, the deep tissue cold, not just surface." Verk absorbed this. His son had been lying in a hedge in a snowstorm for somewhere between 6 and 10 hours. The curse had taken him somewhere outside, alone in the dark, and the storm had come in over him while he was unable to move or call for help or do anything at all, and he had been there until a maid on her morning snow-clearing shift had almost walked past him. There was something he did not want to feel in response to this, and he set it aside for later, which was where he put things he didn't have a structure for. "You brought him here rather than reporting it," he said. She met this evenly. She understood that it was not an accusation but a question wearing the shape of one, and she answered the actual question rather than defending herself against the implied charge. "My quarters were closer, Your Majesty, significantly closer than the guard post or the healing wing." He was very cold, and the warming method I know requires immediate application. The longer the delay, the more difficult the recovery. I calculated that the time required to find and brief an appropriate person and then transport him to a different location was time working against him. Another brief pause, calibrated and honest. I made a judgment. I understand if it was the wrong one. Did you know who he was? Yes, Your Majesty. He looked at her steadily. She looked back at him, which not everyone managed. And you helped him anyway. Yes, Your Majesty. The room was very quiet. The stove ticked. One of the candles gave a small flutter as the wick reached the last of the wax and then steadied. Verk was trying to identify what he was feeling and finding the exercise more difficult than expected. He was practiced at authority, at projecting it, calibrating it, deploying it with appropriate precision for different audiences and situations. He was practiced at strategy, at reading rooms and reading people, and understanding what each piece on the board was likely to do under various conditions. He was practiced at anger, which was a tool he had developed considerable expertise with over the centuries. Anger as a precision instrument for moving situations from one state to another. He was not practiced at standing in a small room that smelled of tallow candles and warm blankets while his son ate porridge and looked at him with those gold eyes that had been anxious and interior and watchful for 4 months and were, right now in this moment, for the first time in 4 months, simply present. Simply here. Simply the eyes of a child who had just been laughing and was now watching his father and waiting to see what happened next without the layer of braced apprehension that had been living behind them for so long. Verk had almost stopped seeing it. What is your name? He said. He knew it. He said it anyway. Myra, Your Majesty, third-tier housekeeping, East Wing. Myra, he put it somewhere deliberate in his attention, not a footnote in a staff roster, not a category, a name. My son will be returned to his chambers now. You will come with us. Her face did not betray what she felt about that. He noted this for the third time, the discipline of her composure, the way she processed and contained without leaking, which was a quality he associated with people who had learned to survive in situations where showing the wrong thing at the wrong moment had consequences. Of course, Your Majesty. He didn't punish her. He had left the throne hall angry, the controlled, bone-deep anger of a ruler whose household had failed in its basic protective function, whose son had spent half a night frozen in a hedge while the palace went about its business around him, whose entire apparatus of care and security had produced exactly nothing useful, while a third-tier maid on a snow-clearing shift had done more in 2 hours with a coat and a pot of warm water than all of it combined. He had carried that anger down the corridors and up the stairs and through the servant wing, had carried it all the way to the doorway of that small north-facing room. And then he had arrived and found that the anger had no reasonable target remaining. She had done everything correctly, more than correctly. She had done what none of his qualified, credentialed, specially assigned people had managed. She had made Solon feel safe enough to laugh. There was no version of punishing that which made any kind of sense, and Verk did not do things that made no sense, regardless of how they made him feel. He had Solon settled back in his proper chambers, and his proper healers notified, and his proper attendants reinstated, all of which Solon endured with the patient cooperative manner of a child who understood the forms and followed them. But that evening, when the healers had done their documentation and the attendants had done their handover reports and the room was quiet, Verk had come in and sat in the chair by the window, not to ask questions, not to receive reports, just to be present, which was not something he had made a regular practice of, and which Solon received with the careful, uncertain attention of a child who is offered something unfamiliar and isn't sure yet whether to trust it. The following morning he sent for Myra. She came to his study with her hands folded and her back straight and her face composed in the professional arrangement he had already identified as her armor, which was made of composure rather than distance. She was not cold, not absent, just carefully managed, a person who had learned that control of expression was a resource and spent it wisely. She stood in front of his desk and answered his questions directly and without embellishment, walking him through what she had done and why, with the plain sequential clarity of someone who had not been calculating, had not been maneuvering, had simply been applying knowledge to a situation in real time. The warming method, he said, walk me through the specifics. She did slow warming outside in, body heat supplementary to ambient, cloths against blankets rather than skin. The reasoning behind each choice, which was not theoretical, she cited mechanism, cited outcome, cited the observable indicators she had been monitoring to confirm the method was working. It was the account of someone who knew what they were doing and why they were doing it and had done it successfully and could explain the whole of it without guessing. Where did you learn this? My grandmother, Your Majesty. She grew up in the high north. People froze there in winter and animals. You learn how to bring things back if you stay there long enough. She taught me when I was small because she said it was knowledge worth having anywhere. And the talking. Something shifted in her expression at this, not vulnerability, but the edge of it, the place where the composure had a seam and something more personal was visible beneath the surface before she settled it back into place. She said that things lost in the cold need something warm to come toward, a direction. She said sound works, a voice, a familiar voice if you have one, but any voice, something that says asterisk here asterisk that says this is where warmth is asterisk. A brief pause. I didn't know if it applied to dragon children. I didn't know if he could hear anything while the curse had him. But it seemed like it couldn't make things worse, and it seemed like it was the thing to do. Verk was quiet for a moment. He was thinking about 4 months, about his son going quieter and quieter, turning inward, learning to make himself small against the possibility of being struck immobile without warning. About the healers who had come with instruments and produced careful documentation of the problem's parameters. About the mages who had worked methodically through magical literature looking for precedent. About himself, who had treated the situation the way he treated every problem, as something to be overpowered, to be surrounded and forced, and resolved through the application of sufficient resources and sufficient will. Because that was his method, and it was a good method and it had always worked. None of it had made Solon feel safe. None of it had made Solon laugh. Something warm to come toward. He looked at Myra across the desk. Unremarkable, dark-haired third-tier East Wing. In his palace for 3 years, in his staff roster for 3 years, and he had not known her name until yesterday morning because there had been no reason for him to know it, because she existed in the category of people who maintained the functioning of his household and were below the threshold of his notice. She had done more for his son with a coat and a story about a dog than every specialist he had assembled. I would like to reassign you, he said, to Solon's household, not as a servant, as a caretaker. The distinction will be made explicit in your documentation and communicated to the rest of the staff. Your tier designation will be revised accordingly. She looked at him steadily, which she kept doing, which kept being notable. May I ask what the role would involve specifically, Your Majesty? Being present, Verk said, when the curse takes him, you know what to do with the physical aspects of it in a way that my healing staff I will acknowledge does not. Talking to him when he's frozen, making sure there is someone who responds to the situation as something happening to a person rather than as a medical event to be managed. He paused. He was not accustomed to saying the next part, but she had earned the honesty of it. He asked about you this morning. Before the healers had finished their morning assessment, before anyone had given him anything else to think about, he asked whether you were in trouble. He watched her face. The composure held, but something moved behind it, a brief, unguarded warmth, the kind that didn't perform itself for an audience, that arose because it was real and not because it was useful. She managed it back into composure within a second or two, the discipline reasserting, but he had seen it. A 3-year maid in an East Wing servant room who had found his son in a hedge and spent 2 hours warming him back to life with nothing but wool blankets and tallow candles and the knowledge her grandmother had given her. And his son had woken up, and his first question the next morning was whether she was in trouble on his account. Something in Verk's chest rearranged itself by a small but definitive amount. He did not have a word for the particular quality of the rearrangement. He filed it. I would be honored, Myra said, to look after him. She said it simply without decoration, the way she said everything. Not performance, not strategy, just the plain truth of it, offered without calculation. Verk nodded once. Good, he said. You will begin immediately. Adequate quarters will be arranged in the main wing. You will have direct access to Solon's household at all hours, and I will instruct the staff accordingly. She inclined her head in acknowledgement, composed and professional, hands still folded, back still straight. He watched her leave the study, and then he sat for a moment in the chair behind his desk, and looked at the window and thought about the gap between asterisk sufficient resources and something warm to come toward, and how long he had been confusing one for the other. It was, he thought, a significant gap. He was not finished thinking about it. What changed? The change in Verk did not happen all at once, which was perhaps why it changed him so completely. He had been changed before, once by war, once by loss, once by a treaty he had signed that had cost him something he couldn't name and had been quietly reorganizing him ever since. He understood the architecture of transformation in the abstract. He knew that things which were built over centuries could be unmade, that even the oldest certainties had foundations that could shift. He had simply never expected the agent of any significant change in himself to be a human woman in a north-facing servant room who kept warm water on a small iron stove, and had learned everything she knew about survival from her grandmother. But a sudden transformation he had observed over the course of his long life could be braced against. It announced itself and gave you time to prepare your resistance, to shore up the structure of what you had been, to decide deliberately which parts you wanted to keep. The sudden kind of change was dramatic and visible, and therefore survivable in its original form if you had sufficient will. What you did not see coming, what arrived without announcement and proceeded without drama, was the gradual kind. The daily small adjustments that each meant nothing on their own terms and together became, before you had noticed the process, simply the new shape of things. The change began, as so many significant things did, with paperwork. He had asked Myra to report to him weekly on Solon's condition. This was practical governance. He had made an appointment decision. He needed information to evaluate whether the decision was producing the intended outcome, so he established a reporting structure. Standard, efficient, the kind of administrative framework he could put in place and then direct his attention elsewhere without anxiety. The reports were not what he expected. She came to his study on the appointed mornings punctually and without fuss, stood in the same place in front of the same desk, and gave him the information he had asked for with the same precision he had come to recognize as her natural register. Episode frequency, duration, physical recovery time, any observable patterns in the timing or triggers. She had begun keeping written records, a small notebook she produced from her apron pocket, its pages dense with the neat compressed handwriting of someone who had taught themselves to write in circumstances where paper was worth conserving. Numbers, times, descriptions, clean data. And then, without breaking her professional composure, without transitioning into a different mode or signaling that the nature of the information was changing, she would continue. That Solon had started drawing again. He had stopped several months before the curse. She had gathered from his attendance, and the absence had been noted but not addressed. One more thing folded into the general anxiety of the period, one more small, ordinary pleasure quietly abandoned. He had asked her 3 days after she took up her post if she had anything to draw with, and she had produced a stub of pencil from the same apron pocket as the notebook. And he had spent an hour producing careful small drawings of things he could see from his window, and she had kept the pencil sharpened since. That he had asked her to teach him her grandmother's warming technique, not because he expected to use it, he was a child and unlikely to be in a position to warm other frozen things, but because he wanted to understand what was being done to him. He wanted to know the mechanism. He wanted agency in his own recovery, wanted to be a participant in it rather than a subject of it, and understanding the method was the form of agency available to him. She had taught him. He had asked detailed questions. He had remembered everything. That he had cried once. She reported this without editorializing, in the same even voice she used for episode frequency and duration. He had been struck by the curse in his sitting room in the late afternoon, and there had been a gap of perhaps 8 minutes between the curse taking him and Myra arriving. She had been at the other end of the wing, and a closed door had muffled the sound of his attendant's alert. When she reached him, he was frozen in the position of having just stood up from his chair, one hand still extended toward the table, and his face was wet. He had been crying while frozen, which was a thing she had not known was possible and which she reported carefully, including her uncertainty about the mechanism. Afterward, when the curse released and she had done the standard warming protocol and he was drinking warm water and his color was coming back, he had said, with the particular quality of delivery that children sometimes achieved, the observation so plain and so large at the same time that it took a moment to understand its full weight, that it wasn't as frightening anymore, because he knew someone would come. Verk read these reports in his study at night, alone, after the official day's business was concluded, and the study was quiet, and there was no one to observe him taking longer than was strictly necessary to process factual information about his son's medical condition. He did not have a word for what he felt reading them. He had a wide vocabulary, assembled over centuries of governance and negotiation and the careful management of relationships with other large and powerful beings. And it did not contain the right word for sitting alone in a study reading a small woman's handwritten account of his son asking for a pencil and crying while frozen and learning the mechanism of his own recovery so he could have something that felt like agency. He sat with the feeling and didn't name it and let it do whatever it was doing. He began coming to Solon's rooms in the evenings. The first time he framed it to himself as a follow-up, an assessment visit, a principal checking on the outcomes of a personnel decision. He was in the corridor near Solon's wing, and it was a reasonable route, and he paused at the door and then went in. Solon was at his drawing table near the window, working on something with the focused application of a child who had rediscovered the pleasure of a specific activity and was now making up for lost time. Myra was in the chair by the fire, mending something, not watching him but present in the particular way of an adult who is available without being demanding. Verk came in and sat in the other chair and said nothing in particular. Neither did Solon immediately. The drawing continued. The mending continued. The stove ticked. After a while, Solon said, without looking up from the paper, that he was drawing the Frostpine hedge from memory, and did his father want to see the preliminary version, and Verk said yes, and Solon brought it over and held it up with the slightly anxious pride of someone who wants the thing they've made to be seen accurately. It was a good drawing. Not technically exceptional, he was a child, but attentive, genuinely observed, the needles rendered with care, and the snow on the lower branches given their actual particular weight. Verk told him so, specifically with the specificity of someone who was actually looking at the drawing and not simply producing the sound of approval. He said which parts were working and why. Solon looked at his father with an expression that Verk filed immediately and then spent the rest of the evening turning over in some chamber of his attention that was not the one he used for political analysis. A child receiving the evidence that he had been seen. He came back the next evening, and the one after that. He stopped framing it as anything. Within a few weeks, Solon had begun to save things for these evenings, which was how Verk knew they had become real, not routine, which was a function of repetition, but real, which was a function of being anticipated and therefore valued. A rock from the garden path, gray and unremarkable to any eye that was not a child's, offered in both hands with the solemnity of a significant gift. A question about the jade accord, which Solon had apparently read about somewhere and wanted the actual account of, not the official version. The drawing he was proudest of that week, which was a careful study of Myra's hands from the angle of the small table beside his bed. Verk answered the question about the jade accord with the actual account, not the official version. He accepted the rock and put it on his desk. He looked at the drawing of Myra's hands, which were rendered with the same attentive care as the frostpine needles, and said something specific and true about it. He was present for all of it without performance and without purpose, and without the constant background management of how he was being perceived, which was the mode he operated in everywhere else and which was, he was beginning to understand, enormously exhausting. Myra was present for most of these evenings. She occupied the background of them with the particular tact of someone who understood the shape of what was happening and was careful not to crowd it, available if called upon, genuinely invisible if not, moving through the room with the unremarkable efficiency of someone whose presence was a quality of the space rather than a competing claim on its attention. He noticed her, which was in itself a change from the version of himself that had not known her name for 3 years. He noticed the way she calibrated herself to the room. He noticed the way Solon checked on her periodically, small glances to confirm she was still there, the particular security of a child who trusts the consistency of a known presence. He began to notice other things. She was the most consistently honest person in his court. This was not an immediate conclusion. It accumulated over the weekly reports and the evening visits, over months of observation, over the steady accumulation of a kind of evidence that was not dramatic but was irrefutable. She was not bold. She was careful, measured, clear-eyed about the reality of her position in a way that people with genuinely nothing to protect usually were. She did not overclaim, she did not perform. But when he asked her opinion, she gave it. Not dressed up, not positioned. When he asked how the morning's episode had differed from the previous week's pattern, she told him, and when she thought his proposed change to Solon's schedule would increase stress and therefore potentially increase episode frequency, she said so, in those words, plainly, with her evidence. When he expressed a view about what Solon needed that she disagreed with, she said what she thought was true instead, without maneuvering into or out of the disagreement, without apparent awareness of the asymmetry of their positions, or perhaps with awareness and simply without the response to it that he expected, which was careful management of what she disclosed to protect herself. She just said what she thought was true, every time, because it was true and the question had been asked and that was sufficient reason. He began extending the meetings beyond Solon's care. He started asking her things that were not on the official agenda, questions that had arrived in the back of his mind during conversations with his advisors and not found satisfactory answers there. She answered them the same way she answered everything, directly, from observation rather than theory, acknowledging what she didn't know without the performing of humility that his advisors deployed when they admitted ignorance. The answers were consistently more useful than what he got from people with formal roles and established expertise. Not because she knew more, she often knew less and said so, but because the answers were not shaped by anything except what she actually thought was true. No agenda, no position to protect, no relationship with him to maintain or advance. She had no power and therefore nothing to lose by saying the accurate thing, and saying the accurate thing was simply what she did. She sees clearly because she has no power to protect. The thought arrived one evening after she had told him, quietly and without any apparent apprehension, that she thought he was handling a particular decision about Solon's educational schedule incorrectly, and explained why and been right. He sat with the thought after she and Solon had gone to their respective rooms and the study was quiet. It disturbed him. He stayed with the disturbance because he had found, since Myra arrived, that disturbances worth paying attention to were usually pointing at something true that he hadn't examined yet. What it was pointing at when he followed it was the structure of his court, the whole architecture of it, every layer, every role, every relationship organized around proximity to and dependence on his authority. Everyone in it with something to gain or lose based on his approval. Everyone therefore managing what they disclosed, filtering the truth through the question of what it cost them, delivering versions of reality that were shaped by the position they needed to maintain. He had built a court full of people with power to protect. He was surrounded by managed truths. He had been governing from managed truths for longer than he wanted to calculate. One grandmother's granddaughter with no rank and nothing to protect had walked into his son's bedroom and started telling him what she actually saw. And it had felt, every single time, like opening a window in a room that had been closed for decades. He stayed with the disturbance for a long time. The curse broke on a morning in early spring, between one day and the next, arriving as a simple absence the way significant things sometimes did. Solon woke up and moved his hand and kept moving it and moved his arm and stood up, and stood there in the morning light looking at his own body with the expression of someone testing ice that has been unreliable and finding it, this morning, solid all the way down. Then he ran. Verk heard about the running from 3 separate sources before he had finished his morning briefing, each account more enthusiastic than the last, the picture assembling itself into the image of a child who had been told he could go outside and had taken this instruction seriously, had run laps of the garden until the attending staff were breathless from following him, had climbed the ornamental rock feature that he had been avoiding for 5 months, had stood on top of it with both arms raised in the manner of someone who had won something, had been coaxed down and run more laps. He had to be practically carried in for the midday meal, and had eaten it in a state of residual fizzing energy, still visibly delighted with the continuous functioning of his own body, still periodically flexing his hands as though confirming that they continued to respond. That evening Verk found him in Myra's rooms. She had been given better quarters when her position changed, east-facing now, a small fireplace, real furnishings rather than the sparse functionality of the third-tier servant rooms. A room a person could live in rather than simply occupy. Solon was sitting on the edge of her chair, which was too large for him, his feet not quite reaching the floor, telling her about his day in the comprehensive sequential manner of a child who wants to convey the full magnitude of what has occurred, beginning at the waking moment and leaving nothing out. Verk stayed in the doorway. Myra noticed him immediately, she always did, but glanced at Solon and back at Verk with the small adjustment of expression that said he's in the middle of something, and Verk stayed where he was and listened. The account was detailed, the specific quality of the grass under his feet after 5 months of careful interior walking, the sound his own running made, the way it felt from the inside to simply move without monitoring for the first place of seizure, the ornamental rock feature which was higher than it looked from the ground and had a good view of the north mountain wall, the decision to raise both arms which had been spontaneous and had seemed like the correct response to the situation. The exact specifications of what he had eaten for lunch, which he reported with enthusiasm despite its clear narrative irrelevance. Myra listened to all of it, she did not hurry it, she did not redirect. She sat in her chair and gave the account her actual attention, asking the occasional question that indicated she was following rather than waiting for him to finish. When Solon finally arrived at the end of the day's events and ran out of specific things to report, he sat for a moment in the quiet of having said the whole of it. Myra said, "You should tell your father, he'll want to hear." Solon gave her the look he had been practicing, the one inherited from Verk, the considered weighing expression that appeared in Dragon Young at early ages and would grow, eventually, into something that moved politics. "He already knows, I told him first." A pause. "But I wanted to tell you too, because you were there for the other part." From the doorway, Verk watched Myra's face. The composure held as it always did, but the warmth that moved through it was real and unmanaged, the brief unguarded quality of something that was simply true and not performing itself for anyone. She looked at this child who had told her she mattered to his good day because she had been present for his difficult months, and she was genuinely moved by it, and she did not hide that she was. "Thank you," she said, "that means a great deal to me." Verk stepped back from the doorway quietly. He went to his own balcony, which faced the opposite direction, north into the mountains, the peaks going purple-gray in the last of the evening light. He stood there for a long time. He thought about power, about what it was and what it was for and what it had cost him that he hadn't fully accounted for. He thought about the version of himself that had stood in a small servant room doorway 4 months ago and found his son laughing, and had carried that image around since like something retrieved from a place he had sealed off, something he hadn't known he was missing. He thought about the rock on his desk, gray and unremarkable, offered in both hands. He thought about the Jade Accord and giving his son the real account rather than the official one, and the way Solon had listened with his whole body, the total absorption of a child being treated as someone capable of receiving true things. He thought about what Myra had given his son, which was presence without agenda, the simple, consistent fact of someone who would show up, who would stay, who would talk to him in the dark because warmth needed a direction to come toward. And he thought about what that had turned out to cost her, which was almost nothing, and what it had produced, which was a child who was running in a garden and raising both arms on top of a rock feature and eating lunch with the enthusiastic relief of someone who had come back to themselves. She would not think she had changed him. He knew this because he knew by now the particular quality of her self-assessment, which was accurate and unromantic. She would think she had done a sensible thing in a cold courtyard and followed through on it, and the rest had been its own logic. She would not want credit for the shape of him at the end of it. But here on the balcony in the spring dark, Verk was honest with himself in the way he had been learning slowly over these months to be honest with himself. She had changed him. Not by doing anything to him directly, not by instruction or argument or force, but by being consistently and plainly herself in his vicinity, and by what that had made visible about the distance between who he was and who he might still become. He had been a sovereign of force. He had confused the capacity to compel outcomes with the capacity to create them, had spent centuries believing that power applied in sufficient quantity could solve any problem, because it had solved most of the problems he had encountered. And then his son had frozen in a snowstorm and all the force in his court had stood at the margins of it, useful for nothing, while a woman with no power and a coat and 7 candles had done the thing that actually mattered. Power was not the capacity to force outcomes. He understood this now in his body, in the part of him that knew things below the level of policy. Power was the capacity to show up for small and frozen things and stay until they were warm enough to come back. He went inside, he sat at his desk. He wrote the order formally, the documentation of a council position, real authority, specific remit, the kind of structural recognition that could not be reduced to sentiment or dismissed as a sovereign's passing preference. A place where what she saw clearly could be brought to bear on things that mattered, where her particular quality of truth without agenda could operate on questions larger than a child's recovery schedule. She would not want it for status, he knew this. She would use it the way she used everything, straightforwardly, in service of what was actually true, without concern for what it cost her. He sealed the order and set it aside for morning. Outside, the spring dark settled over the Ashen Palace and the mountains went fully to silhouette, and the first stars appeared over the northern peaks. In an east-facing room with a small fireplace, a dragon child was probably asleep by now, dreaming whatever children who had spent a day running after 5 months of careful stillness dreamed, large dreams, probably full of motion. In a study 2 floors up, a dragon king sat with a rock on his desk, and the understanding that the most significant thing that had happened to him in recent memory had arrived in the shape of a woman who had almost stepped over his son in the snow and had instead taken off her coat. That Verk thought was what rarer than gold looked like. That was worth a kingdom paying attention to.